I don't know how much my story you know, but I got addicted to heroin.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I got arrested. Yeah. So,
That seems to be a recurring theme. We just had um, Brian Hall from the Eureka Rescue Mission,
uh-huh.
and I think it was, I don't want to misquote him, not meth. He was using and
Yeah.
turned his life around and is now running the rescue mission, trying to help
Yeah,
people out
helping a
and
lot of
bring
people.
them out.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
a great guy. Yeah. Yeah, so mine was a little bit different because I was a journalist and had, won some awards, and I was actually the city editor of the Times Standard. And then
That was all prior to using.
prior,
Oh,
prior
wow.
to using, yeah. I had a knee fracture. I was playing softball back in like probably 2000 or something like that, and I shattered my knee. And I didn't get addicted at that point, but I got introduced to opiates. And over the course of a decade, I took them whenever I could get them. In terms of, oh yeah, that sounds great, kind of a party drug kind of thing. And then ultimately that led to full on crash and burn, shooting up in the bathroom, homeless, arrested, that kind of thing. And then I quit, and that took a while. But about 2015, I finally got clean, and 2017, I got hired at Keat, and they hired me knowing that I was a journalist and I had that background, but I think I needed to prove myself as a stable, law-abiding citizen again. So I did that for a year or so. I did traffic, which is basically scheduling commercials and stuff for on air. And then slowly the opportunity arose for me to do some on-screen work, and then eventually evolved into the show.
You just took the opportunity and ran with it.
Yeah, no, I loved it. I wanted to do that, and then they had a situation where the host for interview with Representative Huffman couldn't do it, and so I stepped in, and they loved the results. And then it was just a couple of weeks before they were like, "Let's do this all the time."
And so you said was it meth? What was?
Heroin.
Heroin, okay.
Heroin. Yeah.
And that arose out of the softball injury.
Rose out of the softball injury. Yeah, I've pretty much come to realize that addiction in a lot of ways is like an allergy. I think that for some people, you try something once, depending on what the drug is, and one person can take it once and it doesn't have any effect. Another person can take it and they're almost instantaneously like enthralled with it, and that's kind of where I was. I'd always had issues with anxiety and social situations, and I found that I was much more comfortable with the edge knocked off with a little bit of drugs, and that slowly became a coping mechanism.
Well, and I'm always, fascinated by the idea that it seems as though a lot of injuries predicate drug use. You get injured, get prescribed whatever painkillers, and the ball gets rolling.
Yeah, I think that unfortunately it's kind of a catch-22 situation, because there's people who get injured and they have a lot of pain and they need help.
Yeah, what are you going to do? Just sit in pain?
watch them suffer and not give them anything. But, there has to be an acceptance that a certain portion of the population, once they're introduced to that, are going to have a real hard time walking away from it. And then there's also the fact that if they're on it consistently for a while, no matter what, they're going to get addicted, because just naturally having that stuff in your body over time, it becomes you become physically dependent upon it. And then once you're in a situation where, if you wake up in the morning and if you don't have a particular thing, all you can think about is that thing, and you feel like total dirt, you start doing things to get it because you can't imagine living without it. Now, one of the things I was able to do as a result of all of this was when I started up at Keat, I proposed a documentary called Addicts Among Us, which was basically, I wanted to show people that it wasn't just homeless people or people with, who were really, really poor, or sort of the typically marginalized people who get addicted to drugs. It can be anybody. And over the course of my recovery, I had met lawyers and judges and police and every walk of life you could imagine who are in recovery, who had experienced addiction. And so I wanted to kind of erase that idea that it's all people who are weak-willed or of bad character who get addicted. It's everybody. And wanted to make people, sort of be able to talk about it more. So we did a documentary talking about how, addiction starts, about its relationship with trauma. a lot of people who have trauma find themselves attracted to opiates and other drugs because it allows them to sort of deal with whatever PTSD they might be dealing with, allows them to sleep, deals with a lot of those symptoms and makes them feel more confident. And also point out that Eureka has the unfortunate distinction of being one of the highest addiction rates in the country, but also one of the highest trauma rates for children. So we have a situation here where you have a really poorly functioning child welfare system that perpetuates, or at least doesn't rescue kids out of traumatic situations, and is basically manufacturing future addicts who then go on to have children and traumatize their own kids. And so it's like this self-defeating cycle of bad behavior and addiction. And at the time when I was making that movie, they didn't have any treatment facilities for free. Like, if you wanted to get treatment when I was addicted, the only place that would take you for free was Teen Challenge. And I don't know if you know anything about that program. It's good for what it is, but you have to be basically a born-again Christian.
I was going to say, isn't that a faith-based one?
Yes, yeah.
Well?
And I have no problem with faith, but I actually tried the program. I went in for a week, and I had been used to a little bit of recovery from a time I'd spent in rehab before, and it was like, let's talk about your issue, talk about what drug you take, why do you take it, why do you think you're driven to take it, that kind of stuff. And it was more about just like, give up your addiction to Jesus Christ, and he will lift it from you. And he might well have done that, but I didn't have the wherewithal to think about it that way. I'm not a Christian, so that's probably why. So after a week, I left, and I tried every which way to get into any kind of treatment facility, and there just weren't any. There are two, at the time there were two, CRC, which is a residential facility, and then also there was Crossroads. But those were, the only way to really get into them was to be arrested and referred by a court. And I hadn't been in serious trouble, and so I didn't have any way to get recommended for that by a judge, and I didn't have the health insurance to pay for it or the cash in my pocket. Now there is a facility, I'm going to forget the name of it, Waterfront Recovery, yeah, that's what it is, where the old Mac Center is, next to Pepsi Cola down by Target. And that's a great facility, and they'll put you, you can stay there for as long as, I think, 3 to 6 months. And it's a dual diagnosis facility, so they also treat mental illness and anxiety disorders and that sort of thing, and also help you rebuild your life while serving you good food and giving you a place to live. And that's exactly what was needed. I think we probably need more beds, but it's still the answer. I mean, people need treatment.
Now, was it hard for you, having been established and been successful in your career, to then start using? Did that weigh on you? The idea
Yes.
of, what am I doing? Like, I've reached where I wanted to go, and I'm still climbing, and now I'm backtracking in this way.
Yeah, no, that was always the struggle. A lot of shame, for one thing, because you're trying to maintain a professional. I mean, I was still trying to be a professional journalist up until I quit, when it became a point where I couldn't do the job right. You know what I mean? Like, I would, I had to get well. They call it get well, by like using a little bit in the day, and that would allow me to do my work. But I was still trying to keep the basic minimum standards of the job and do my work. At the point where that no longer became tenable, I quit, because I didn't want to embarrass the newspaper, and I didn't want to get caught and have all that stuff go public. And the idea was, well, I'll clean myself up, and then I'll come back, or I'll come back in some other position at some other, news organization. But that didn't happen. I ended up getting worse and worse and worse, and ultimately I got arrested for possession. And that's when the real struggle began, because I had thought that if I quit the newspaper and left, then when I got arrested, or if I ever got arrested, it wouldn't be a big deal. It's like, okay, he's no longer that, so that won't be an issue. Well, the chief of police at the time recognized my name when I was busted and sent a press release saying former editor of the Times-Standard, James Faulk, was arrested for heroin possession. And it became, an immediate thing. It led to Channel 3 News. It was above the fold. And the Times-Standard, the Journal, had a cover story on it. It was just like bam, there it is. And so that was really, really hard, especially trying to get better, because I had to forgive myself, and I had to also become okay with the fact that some people were just going to judge me no matter what. And a lot of people who I thought were close or friends, some of them didn't want to have anything to do with me at first, and so there was a lot of adjustment to figure out who were really friends and who weren't. And for the most part, I mean, I'm back in terms of my reputation and all that kind of stuff. Like I eventually rebuilt it all, and but I have a better sense of what's real in terms of the relationships with people that I have. But yeah, no, that was very difficult, because every time I went somewhere, people would be like, "Oh yeah, you're that guy. You know, you were doing this, and then you got busted for heroin," and yeah, it was just hard.
Yeah, hard to shake that.
Yeah, it was definitely hard. And, you know, a lot of people assume that once you're addicted to a drug like that you're just lost. And that's not the case. But for, you know, people who don't have any experience with it, or like to think that they're not an addict because they're somehow superior to people who are, they're just forever going to judge you. And that's, you know, that says more about them than it says about you, but it's a hard thing to realize when you're used to a certain level of respect from your peers and whatnot.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but morphine is basically heroin, right?
Yeah, I mean, the history of that is that morphine was first, and it was highly addictive, and a lot of people got addicted to it. And then so I think it was a European chemist thought, well, I'm going to invent a type of morphine that's non-addictive. So he invents heroin. And sure enough, it helps people get off morphine. But they
Then you're just stuck on heroin.
You're just stuck on heroin. Yeah, yeah. So heroin was meant to be the answer for morphine addiction. That didn't work out. And yeah. Same family. And so are all your, like, codeine, hydrocodone, which is Vicodin. All those are from the poppy plant. Papaver somnifera.
So what is it like being on heroin? Are you still productive? Is it just kind of conk you out and you just are kind of passively there? Because that's the idea, right? Is you see the image of somebody sitting on a couch just zoned out with a needle in their arm.
Yeah, that's not how it starts. Basically, usually people don't start shooting it. Like I started smoking it. Like you would take a little chunk and put it on a piece of tinfoil. And I originally had gotten addicted to pills, like from the pain pills. And it's all the same family. So basically what happened was I had a steady access to Vicodin for a long time. And that's when I was at the newspaper for the most of the time I was there, the last 3 years that I was using at the newspaper. It was just a couple of Vicodin pills a day, you know, and it was like, oh yeah, life's better with these and without these, so why not take them? Eventually, it gets harder and harder to get those pills. And at the time, there was sort of an awakening, both here and nationally, to the reality of the pharmaceutical pushing of pain medication. That was right when OxyContin was breaking huge, and so those drugs dried up. And unfortunately, if you know the right or the wrong kinds of people, you can get heroin on the street. That's a lot cheaper. It lasts a lot longer, and it's just available more so than the pain meds. The problem is that you get a lot higher, and then you also get a lot more addicted, and then it's an accelerating process. So you start by, like, I basically woke up sick and hated that feeling. And then I was in a band, and I've been a musician for years. So I have always known people who were kind of like, oh yeah, I can get this or I can get that. And one of my musician friends knew where to get Oxy. So I was doing Oxy for a little while. And then it was like, this is so expensive. Let's just pay $20 and get this little black piece of tar that you can throw on a thing, and then you're well for the whole day. Well, that's worked for the first couple days, and then you smoke more, and it eventually becomes an issue. Now, I was hanging out with people who are obviously maybe not the best character. Not that heroin users aren't of good character, but these particular gentlemen weren't, at least at that time, weren't thinking clearly or whatever. Anyway, one guy at one point says that the only way I didn't have any money and I needed to get some heroin because I was really sick, and he's basically like, the only way I'm going to give it to you is if you shoot it up. And so I thought about it for about 5 minutes, and I'm like, sure. So he shot me up in my neck the first time, and it knocked me on my ass, like you talk about, where it's just like, and that was the first time I did it, and the only time I did it for a while. But then eventually the smoking of it didn't do enough for me, and it just kept accelerating. And so then it was like, well, then I'll start shooting it up, and I'll do it in places where no one's going to notice. And eventually you get to the point where you need it to just be functional. So you're not walking around dazed and confused most of the time, because that costs a lot of money to get into that state. You just use enough to be able to wake up in the morning and go to work or go to the store without sweating and having muscle spasms and I don't know if you can cuss on here or not.
Oh yeah.
Okay, or without shitting yourself. So
Which is ideal. I don't think you want to do that in public, especially.
You want to avoid that. So yeah, eventually it turns into a mode of survival. Now you want that. I mean, like the addict, that point where you're like kind of slumped out and you nod out, which is what they call it. That is your happiest moments, because that's the feeling that you're always chasing, but it becomes increasingly hard to get there.
It's the idea of chasing the dragon.
Yeah, exactly right.
It's just this vicious cycle where the further you go, the more
harder it is to get there.
Yeah, and the deeper you have to go to just maintain.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So how instrumental for you was doing that documentary? Was that kind of like a catalyst moment where you could put all these pieces together and see,
yeah,
this is like a vicious cycle for everyone that's involved?
Well, I mean, I knew the cycle part of it, what the addiction element of it was. For me, the documentary worked in tandem with a column I used to write for the Lost Coast Outpost called Dead Reckoning. So after I'd gotten clean, I got a job at a cemetery. I was an office manager, and it was after I got clean. I was still kind of wrestling with it, so I wasn't totally clean all the time, but I was doing a lot better. And I started writing this column for the Lost Coast Outpost, and that was when I got that column. That's when things turned around for me. Like I basically used it as like a form of therapy, and this what's led to the later documentary is that I wrote a lot about trauma that I'd experienced as a child. My dad was a paranoid schizophrenic, and did the kind of shit that crazy people do. And so writing about that, and then it started with the cemetery and like dealing with issues of life and death, and sort of set the tone for the column. And then I basically explored all my issues in this column that I did for 2.5 years.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you pull that out just a little bit away from... Yep, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So basically that allowed me to plumb my own kind of depths and figure out like why I was driven to use, and kind of figure out my own addiction. And so by the time I got to the newspaper, I had all of that. I had done a lot of thinking about it, and I had a lot of energy put away into trying to take it all apart and like figure out how I'd ended up where I was. And I knew I wanted to do a project. And at the time, I thought it was going to be a book. But then working at a public television station, I was like, well, maybe I can propose it as a documentary. And that's what we ended up doing. And I did enough research to figure out that the trauma element of it was something that had happened, that happens to most people who are addicted. And so I was able to kind of connect my story with a couple other folks who were also in the documentary. And we got a significant amount of grant money from various local institutions who were kind enough to chip in. And I think we connected with quite a few people. We won some awards, and that was really the point where I felt like I had taken this experience I had and turned it into something valuable and worthwhile in terms of this documentary and my story, and mainly freely communicating that, yes, I was an addict, but that's not all I am, and that I can use this experience to help other folks and, maybe improve the situation a little bit. And by doing so, I got my my confidence back in terms of journalism, and led to the show that we've been doing for a couple of years now.